Hey folks, today we are streaming. Last time we streamed from my house, and the time before that we also streamed from my house. So this will be a new experience, and I'm gonna try to keep my voice down a little bit because there are people working here and that kind of thing. But I'm working today out of the Adler Planetarium, so that's pretty exciting. Today we're going to be working on the Zooniverse mobile app again. That's what we've worked on the previous 2 times as well. And the first time it was an introduction to the app and what it does, so I'll link that in the description. The second time we started implementing a feature called Museum Mode that I can show you, which is essentially that on this app, when we go into particular projects, in a museum, we want the app to appear with this dark background like this instead of a lighter background, even though for you as just a user of the application, it appears with a lighter background. And we want that darker background because museums tend to be dark places, and so it's important for us to have a UI that works well in the physical space where the app's going to be installed. Last time, you'll recall we created a whole bunch of these yellow warning messages here. And they say, failed prop type, invalid prop in museum mode of type string, supplied to each of these various places. So we created a bunch of these warnings last time with the way that we implemented museum mode. Today, we're going to be fixing those. So last time what we did was we went to each of our components and we implemented conditional styling such that in museum mode specific things will be dark and in non-museum mode those things will be light. And in the places where we've used this conditional styling, you can see we have an attribute called in museum mode. And in reality, the way that we're going to get information about whether we should be in museum mode or not is going to be from our API, from our backend. We didn't have the information when we started this about what the API would look like or what the shape of the response would be. And so instead, we put in this.props.project.toString. We stringified the names of each of the projects that we have inside of the application. And so what this does is that project.toString returns a string which evaluates to true, which means that in museum mode is going to be evaluated as true, and so we'll see these projects in museum mode wherever we've put this. But the warning that we're seeing is saying that in museum mode is expecting a Boolean value, and we're not providing a Boolean value. What we're providing is this string. And that's not what it's looking for. So although it works, we end up with that warning. We're going to be changing that today, but in order to do that, we're going to be doing a little bit of exploring of the Zooniverse API. So Zooniverse has a number of open source projects. Our mobile app is one of them. I'll show you some of the others. Okay, so we work out of this list of repositories on one called mobile, but there's also this one called Panoptes, and this is our API. Both our web frontend and our mobile frontend use this API to get information about projects and users in the Zooniverse. So this is where we're going to be getting our information from. And so we need to find out where in the API we're going to find out information about whether or not we're supposed to be in museum mode. Now, what I was hoping to do today was to give you an opportunity to see how some of the calls worked yourself by using an HTTP client like Postman. The thing is that Postman does work in certain cases. So for example, we can make a GET call to projects with these headers. And we can get back information about individual projects in the Zooniverse. These are going to be experiments that academics are running in order to get information with the help of citizen scientists about everything from pictures of space to motion cameras that are installed in the Serengeti and under the ocean to satellite images of kelp along the shores of our continents. So we can get information about the projects from here. And that works fine, but it's worth noting that this is a public endpoint. When it comes to the authenticated endpoints for our API, we use OAuth 2 as our authentication client, and I have had some trouble getting the OAuth 2 to work with Postman right now. And I'm not exactly sure why that is, but I've tried a little bit. And I have not figured it out yet. So eventually, hopefully, I would figure that out. For your reference, what I've tried is to come in here, do OAuth, and then get a new access token. For those of you unfamiliar, the way that OAuth works is that you create a client application that authenticates, and then that client application is the one that gets that receives authentication information, allows it to access the API. So we have some documentation, in fact, about how to do this that I can link in our description. But here it is. Essentially, we have a wiki in our project that has information about how to authenticate with Postman. This documentation is a little bit out of date. So when I went through this process, this form is what I was expecting to see. Or rather, not this form. This form I did see in our application. But then in Postman, this form I was expecting to see. And now the form looks a little bit different, and you can see that here. When I do get new access token, and I've been very careful about making sure that this client ID and client secret are largely obstructed in this live stream. But essentially, I'll put in all of this information, and then when I request a token, I get could not send request. My next step would probably be to curl it and see specifically what error message we're getting back. I did ask people on a couple of forums and do some Googling, but I haven't figured this out yet. If one of you has Postman specific expertise and wants to pair with me on this, what we can do is we can pair it another time and we can record it rather than stream it. And then we can like blur out any client ID and client secret stuff, and then we can put it up. But today, I'm going to talk about a couple of other ways besides an HTTP client to get information about our API. So the first is through our documentation. We have API documentation for Panoptes. This documentation is also somewhat out of date. And that you'll find is not uncommon. Even the largest and most profitable projects in the world, the Apple documentation, the Python documentation, aren't always necessarily up to date. And so it so happens that there are some things in our Zooniverse documentation that are out of date as well. So if you find something that's out of date while you're working on it, I would encourage you to come over to GitHub, since this is open source, and propose a change. We'd love to have y'all contributing to our API and to our API documentation, and it would be really fun to receive some issues and pull requests there, updating some of this documentation, because many eyes are better than one pair of eyes, I guess. Okay, so this is our documentation. And then another option we have is to explore our third-party libraries. So for JavaScript, we have a third-party library, or we have a library that we have built to be our API client. And you can see us import that in places where we make API calls. And so what we can do is come in and look at the code itself and attempt to figure out what's going on if we have questions about our API or how it needs to be called. I do a whole blog post on reading other people's code and figuring out what's going on in it and learning things from it, so I can link that in the description as well. But that's something that we may end up doing live today as we start to get this working. So, the smallest version of what we want to do today is we want to replace at least one of these two strings with the actual API information in order to get the truth about whether or not we should be in museum mode for this particular project. So here's our app. I'm a test user inside of our staging environment, and I have asked to be given access to use museum mode on this multi-answer question test project. So the way that our API works is that we have something called project roles. Let me go down to project roles here. Okay. So project roles describe what an individual user is supposed to be doing on a project. We have a couple of different ones. We have a volunteer, we have an expert, which is a special kind of volunteer who has specialized expertise in the given project. We have an owner. This is usually the researchers who created the project. And now we have also added a role called museum. And this is a specific login that's attached to museum that can show a specific project in museum mode. So that's what we're going to be switching our conditionals to today, rather than stringifying the project name. And so we know that information about roles is going to come back on the project. For that reason, it makes sense for us to go into projects. This is where we're making the API call where we get projects from. And get a little bit of information about what the roles are. So another way that we can go about discovering our API is that we can do it through the code itself. So I know, for example, that I'm having some trouble getting OAuth to work when I'm trying to use an external HTTP client, but I know that our API client inside of the application is working properly. So what I can do is I can log in on the mobile application and know that authentication is then taken care of for any of the following API calls that I make. And I didn't show you this, but essentially what you would do is I could sign out here and then I could sign back in with my credentials, which I won't do because then you could see my password to the staging site, letter by letter. But that's one way that you could get authentication to the application. And then you can come in and, for example, fetch paginated projects will happen authenticated in that case. Okay. So here's what we'll do. I'm going to back this out a little bit. You'll notice that inside of our promise here, you see some detail calls. What I've done is I've started printing out some information. So this typically isn't here, but what I want to do is I want to see inside of my debugging flow where the projects got in, and then we can go through the projects and map over them and get information about what is in each project. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to get a single project and look at the shape of the JSON that represents that project. Now a project is fairly large, and I know this, so I don't want to see the JSON for every single project. So I would rather just have one. So here's what we'll do. And there are a number of ways to do this. You can do this with an index. You don't have to do it with a Boolean like this. I'm doing it like this because that makes it clearer to you, like readers or watchers or what have you, what's going on. So let's do, we're going to log our project here. Okay. I like to keep a little celebratory notice in all caps to make it easier for me to notice where my log statements are supposed to be showing up. So you'll recall this debugging console from last time. And now we can see here, we have got the projects, and so we know that this resource is the project that we requested. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to look through this JSON and determine if I see anything that looks like it is role related. And I'll filter by roles to make that a little easier. I'm not actually seeing it filter. I'm not quite sure why that is. I've got the comments up. I don't expect that many people are watching this live stream because I only announced it on a couple of Slack channels and I didn't do it that far in advance. But I'll keep it there in case somebody decides to pop in and say something. Let's see. I do not see roles in here so far. Perhaps what it's telling me with this is that role does appear in here somewhere, but it won't tell me where. That's cool. Not there. Shortcut. Nope. Here we go. So we have project roles right here, and what you see is an array with an ID in it. My suspicion is that this ID correlates to a role, and if we go and we get that role, then we'll be able to see whether we are supposed to be in museum mode for a particular project. So now let's take the next step forward since we've identified where we're supposed to be getting this information from our API for each individual project. Now, instead of only getting the first one, I want to see if that exists for several of the projects. So what we'll be doing is now logging. Is that what it was called? Yes. Yeah. Okay. Let's rerun our app. Cool. Hop over to debugging. Not seeing anything. Let's try again. Oh, I see. I've left my role filter on. There we go. All right, so now we have each of the individual projects. Am I still printing out? Oh, I am printing out the project still. That's fine. We don't need it, though. So now we see that we have these arrays of IDs. So now we need to go get a role and take a look at the shape of a role. So how are we going to get a role? Well, we can go over to our documentation and see if it says anything about how to get roles. So we have our documentation here. Project role. Perfect. A project role resources contains an array of roles assigned to a user for a particular project. It has the following attributes: ID created at, updated at, and roles. I suspect that roles is what we're going to want. Project roles are visible to the project owner and the user given roles. Roles may be collaborator, tester, scientist, moderator, translator. I think this list is out of date. We certainly have one called owner, and we just added one called museum. And so I think this list is out of date. So what we want to do is retrieve a single project role. And it looks like it's a GET request. It is sort of what we would expect a RESTful request to look like for something like that. So we could try to get this with an HTTP client like Postman, provided that we were able to authenticate, because when we're authenticated is when we're able to figure out which roles we have for each individual project. That having been said, since that's not working for us, what we'll try to do instead is to use our code to get the information. First, let's excise our print statements. So here's what we can do. Let's take a look at where we make other API calls inside of this file. I'm looking at fetch paginated projects right now, and I want to figure out what the format of the way that we use our API client is to determine whether I can use the API client to get more information about the project roles as well. So as I'm reading this, it looks like we have this API client that we imported up here. And we tell it that we specifically want to get the projects. Then we include some parameters, and then we say what we want to have done with the result. We can do something very similar if we just want to get a project role and see what it looks like. Let's do something like this. I don't think we're going to need any inputs for this. We can leave it a fat arrow function because we'll end up taking this out anyway. Get a role. And let's go over to the documentation again and see what this call was. Project underscore roles. And then we'll want our ID to be something. We'll go get one of these over here. Let's do this. So that should give us our roles back. We're already pushing several paginated projects calls onto our call stack. So what we can do is go ahead and push get a role too. Recall, we're going to be taking this out. And you know what? Let's follow in our prior convention and do this too. Cool. Looks like we have a successful role fetch. Now let's take a look at the shape of this thing. I'm going to stop and get some water, but you can take a look. Alright, so what I notice about this shape is that we have this array called roles, and the first thing in it is an owner. This is where I'm expecting our museum attribute to show up. So let's do this. Inside of projects, let's undo all of this. And then add all of this back. And get a little bit of information about that specific project that we know is supposed to have museum mode for us. So we need to do, we also need to include the name of the project or something that we can identify it with. Let's try that. Yay. All right, so multi-answer question test project is the one that we know is supposed to have museum mode associated with it. It looks like we have two roles here, 10.847 and 10.817 or something like that. So now, let's save this information in a Scratch file. That's fine. And then redo everything that we had just done. So we get rid of this. And then now that we've done this one time, I think we can safely copy pasta it. And this time, let's choose that role. Wow, where's my C? Rock on. Okay, so then we can do and then we should be able to print our thing. Sweet, okay. Here's our role. And it says expert. So it looks like that's not the museum mode role that we're looking for. Let's see if the other one is. I really hope this one is, or else we have to figure out something else. Our assumptions were not correct about how this works. Oh, cool. So now our roles are owner and museum. So now if we were to come in here and say something like then we should get back just that array, right? Yeah, we do. Cool. So now we know how we need to get this information. Now let's take a look at where we're passing this through. So for every project right now, so we resolve to a list of projects, right? So ideally what I would like to do is include this information at the step where we fetch the projects and then key off of it in each of the components where we use it. So how do we add information to the projects in the format that we prefer? We could theoretically do something like we are doing where we get the avatars for the projects. Let's take a look at where we're using get avatars for projects. No usages. Ah. So it looks like we want to add the projects here. So let's see if we would be able to do something like that with the code like the stuff that we wrote up above. So right now we don't actually care what the roles are. We only care that each of those roles, we care if one of them is museum or not. So let's do this. We'll start by mapping to a project and we'll say, we'll start with museum mode being false and say project links was it roles? I think it was like this. Is that how it was? I think so. And then we can take something like this. Let's do this. For each. Okay, cool. And this is going to be a role ID. And that's going to be the role ID right there. And then if that includes museum, basically. Right? And then out here, right? All right, so now we've got this museum role for project. I think it's upset because we don't use it. Yeah, it's upset because we don't use it. You're good, you're good. Okay. So, what we're going to want to do here, honestly, I would be shocked if this works on our first go. Oh, we still have to change this to include museum. determines whether the array contains the specified element. It returns true or false. Let's try it just like that. Now, am I super into stringly typed? There are some risks associated with having stringly typed pieces like this in your code. It's relatively common in iOS development. This, of course, being React Native, it's not necessarily guilty of it because of the iOS thing, but it's something that we could potentially take a look at later, replacing with some sort of enumerable or object or something with a little bit more predefined roles where we're not going to end up with like typos and things that mess things up. Okay, so now let's go down here and let's do a similar thing. And I want to say that we made that work for all museum mode projects. Like it takes in a list. Let's make sure that's true. It is, so let's go ahead and change the name here to museum mode for projects. What? There we go. Okay. Is this also the way that avatars works? Yeah. Let's also do this. Let's move that down so that we've assigned it. And then what I'd like to do is I'd like to take out our other console.logs so that it's not confusing. We don't need this anymore, for example. All right, let's give it a go. Please close down Zooniverse and try again. Cannot read property for each of undefined. Okay. Let's pull this up and see what each of these projects might be. So we got one project. Now let's do this. See what we end up with. Would you looky there? Project.links.roles is undefined for this. I wonder if project.links is undefined as well for this particular project. Doesn't look like it. So sometimes perhaps there isn't roles. So we have a couple of options here. We can say something along the lines of create a guard clause like this. So now this other logic is only going to run if project.links.roles is there. Otherwise, we employ a default of saying, all right, well, if roles aren't there, then we're going to set museum mode to false. Now, we can come back and refactor this later. I'm not in love with the way that it looks and the way that it reads right now. And it looks like that's going to happen down here, regardless of whether or not we also do it here. So instead, for now, let's do something like this. Now we can also do string formatting here, but I'm not planning on leaving this in, so I'm not too worried about it. All right, well, that appears to have resolved that particular issue. Now let's take a look. No roles found. For any of them. So let's go take a look again at what roles is supposed to be there, because I might be misremembering what roles is. So let's take a look at links. Oh, it's project roles. Just kidding. It is project roles, not roles. So this is going to be project roles. And this is also going to be project roles. And it may be that this isn't happening at all, in which case we can take out this conditional. Cool. So now we're not seeing that not being able to find it anymore. We're also seeing false for all of these. So museum mode is theoretically false for all of these, which is fine, except that it should be true for multi-answer question test project. So let's get a little bit more information here. We don't need this anymore, which is exciting. Removes a level of complexity that's not necessary. And then what I would like to do is log what each of the roles are and just see what we're getting here. So it's roles, which we're getting a hold of here. So what I would like to do now is print one level deeper and see what happens to us. I'm going to use the bathroom real quick, and we'll come back in just a few minutes. We're back. We're almost back. I need to make this tea, and then we're back. But what you're seeing is essentially a process that you can use to explore our API, even if a third-party HTTP client isn't necessarily working. More broadly, what we're looking at here is opportunities to work around when something is broken or something is missing when we're maintaining open source software. Software, broadly, What we think of as software and software development comprises the Herculean efforts of thousands of people all over the world coordinating those efforts extremely poorly. So it makes sense for us to have some tools available to us in order to be able to continue that process in a resilient fashion if everything's not perfect at our starting point. Most projects you'll find are like this, and we tend to think of workarounds like this as hacking, and I don't necessarily have a problem with that distinction, but we also have a tendency to use the term hacking when we're describing it in that way in a pejorative sense. And to be sure, if we continue to do things that way and don't go back and take a look at the underlying mechanisms that are forcing us to do them that way, then we can end up contributing to technical debt rather than allowing that debt to come down, contributing to complexity that doesn't have to be there, I guess I should say, rather than making things simpler for people as the project goes on. That having been said, as a discovery tool, these methods and workarounds can be extremely helpful, to the point that I think it can also be helpful for us to practice and to document them the same way that we document the way that things should work when everything's going correctly in, say, our API documentation or our READMEs about our software. These types of skills can make it easier for you to ramp up on any given code base, regardless of the state that it was left in. And that's not to say anything about this particular code base. I'm relatively happy with the state that this code base has been left in, given the circumstances under which it was developed, as I spoke about in the previous video. But practicing skills like this can give you more of a leg up in those situations where it can be the amount of information that you have going in can feel discouraging at first. So let's hop back into coding. Okay, now the T is in the way. Move. All right. This is peach tea. It's caffeine free theoretically. Oh, I do want to show y'all something because this is really cool. Do you see this? Okay, so this is in the Adler Planetarium, and what this is, it shows you, so there's this green button on that screen. It's not just like a monitor. It's a sort of like a diorama. And that green button, it says press button to see how the night sky could be with less light pollution. So this is the skyline of the city of Chicago. And when I press this button, you can see it's very bright here. And when I press this button, that'll fade. And I don't know if you can see this particularly well on the recording. Yeah, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to show this to you. But you're able to see a lot more stars, and you're also able to see the shape of the Milky Way galaxy going through the sky diagonally right there. This used to be on display in the planetarium, but right now we have some other really cool things on display in the planetarium, and so we didn't have room for that. But if you want to come see the other things that we have on display, that would be awesome. We have this really cool touch table exhibit that allows you to categorize galaxies that were photographed by telescopes in space. And you get to do it with your friends. And it's a lot of fun. My friend and colleague Will developed it. It's really awesome. 6 people can classify galaxies all at one time. And you should come check it out. And advertisement. They didn't pay me to say any of that. I just think it's really cool. All right. So let's get back to coding. What are we doing? Like something wasn't showing up that we wanted to have show up. Command Option I, open my inspector. Cool. Let me just rerun the app. Let's just like figure out where I am. Oh, here we go. Oh, well, there they are. Where were they before? Now I'm upset. All right, well, this multi-answer question test project, now labeled as being in museum mode, it is not. And that is annoying to me. But here it is. So museum should be in there. And this is making me wonder if I like spelt it wrong or something. So we're logging the roles. Let's do the age-old trick of adding questions. Well, it appears to happen at least once. Exactly once, I should say. Let's see here. Here we have multi-answer question test project, which still appears to have that thing be false. You know what we can do here? We can get the display name of the project that we're in, and we can also get what else do I want to know? I guess nothing really. That's like famous last words, isn't it? What else? There's definitely some crucial piece of information that I'm going to need to figure this out that I don't have there. See, this is why y'all have to come, because you can scream at me when there are things I'm not noticing in the comment box. All right, check it out. Owner, collaborator, blah, 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 blah. Sweet. For multi-answer question test project, that is running. I feel like this is a scoping issue. What if we do this? Goodbye. I'm aware that the formatting, I used camel case here, and there's snake case on this, and it actually should probably be snake case because we're talking about JSON and that's the convention. So we might change this, but I want to see what happens next. I want to see how it works, and then we can change that from camel case to snake case. In fact, let's make a refactor list. Here, list. Gee, why can't I spell keys properly? It's because I'm live coding and I get all nervous. Sweet. And this should probably be whatever. We'll make a markdown one next time. Incremental improvements, people. All right, so we got our multi-answer question test project here. I don't know that we necessarily need. Let's take another look here. In museum mode, this is happening only one time, which is good. But we're still getting false for all of them. Is that the case? What is different between the way we're doing this? Get avatars for projects. Do we need to return the project here? I feel like we don't. And I also don't feel like Like if that were the problem, this would still be true in the one case where it's supposed to be. Let's do one more experiment here. Put that in there and see what happens. All right, so at that point, multi-answer question test project is true. So let's do this now. Let's get rid of all this. What the? Thank you. All right, what I want to do is I want to see where that's used. So we have our museum mode call. Where is avatar call being used? Let's do this. Great. And now, let's do this. MIDE. In museum MIDE. All right, let's take a look. Dee-dee-dee-dee. So they're all false. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Let's do something a little more useful here. Get some more information about what's going on. So multi-answer question test project is still false there, eh? Why? Project detail calls, we add the museum mode call, and we wait for all of those to return. Mm-hmm. I wonder if I'm not understanding something about the order that these happen. And then, of course, we could further simplify that, but I want to make sure that it's working. Ooh, now it's mad. Because we are not, something about this is not returning out, which is why we were able to get in museum mode to be true for the one project here, and then after that, it was just false again, because we were assigning it up here and that was working. Let's see. I wonder if I need to do this here and then say, like, we can also simplify this to that. Let's give that a try. No. Mobile friendly and approved, plain project, cool test project, blah, blah, blah. Are the avatars getting through right there? Yeah, they are. So let's make these identical. Also, I might be able to just do this. Let's see if that works. Yeah. That's cool. Projects. All right, so we know this works. We don't need this anymore. We have return API client.type. Get, that's fine. Then make a change to the individual project. And then there's a catch statement. Stub out avatar rejection because it's optional for projects to have avatars. That's fine. I don't think we need to do that because it's not really optional for projects to have roles that I'm aware of. Let's remove that again and see what happens. All right. Well, this is anticlimactic. But what we're going to do wait a second. Wait a second. This is going to get set. So this is going to get set for each of the project roles. And so maybe it's getting set true and then getting set back to false. What if we do this? Hold on. I think there's probably a more elegant way to do this, but let's start with break. It's upset because we're returning this. When you're returning something, All right, we need to run to a meeting, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to this. I know this is an anticlimactic end, but if you have ideas, I would love to hear about them in the comments, and then we're going to do another live stream where we come back to this question, okay? All right, talk to y'all later. Happy hacking.